In the lead up to Elden Ring's release, I remember thinking that grafting was going to have much more to do with the game's central plot. Going through Limgrave and hearing about what was being done in Stormvale Castle was genuinely unsettling, and I was excited to see this horror continue to unfold. But as I made my way through Limgrave and put the blade to its boss Godrick, ready to explore the rest of the game, I realised that grafting was almost entirely localised to Stormvale. This was a tool of Godrick the Grafted and doesn't really have a place in the game's wider world, making up only a small part of its story. At first I was disappointed. This was such an interesting piece of theming that I hated to see underutilised, especially when you consider its wider thematic implications in a world dominated by worship to a tree. What I really ought to have come to expect from FromSoft is that grafting is just a piece of something bigger, in that it is just one of the many ways that the game's director Hidetaka Miyazaki explores the body. And this to me is what Elden Ring is really about. Though grafting belongs to Godrick, his revenants and his scions, continuing through the game sees virtually every character of note take part in some form of bodily modification, willing or unwilling. From Millennia and her Valkyrie's prosthesis to Godwyn and his horrific transformation following his assassination on the Night of the Black Knives. The gods and demigods of the lands between all play with life and body in some capacity. Crater Rykard's ambitions lay in communion with the world-eating serpent, and Ranni the Witch has shed her Empyrean body entirely. This exists beyond Marika's pantheon too. Look at Hunter D, his armor entwined with that of his brother, and the many jarmen scattered around the base game and the DLC, an amalgamation of body part stuff preserved and made sentient. The tool you use to participate in invasions in Elden Ring is even, you guessed it, a part of the body. The very order that dominates the game's society is taught by giant fingers, hands of God. Everyone in Elden Ring has a body image issue. Okay, no, that's not what I'm trying to say, but as we'll learn throughout this video, there is a massive amount of agency over bodies in the lands between, one's own, but also the creation thereof. This extends to personal identity as well, something we'll put under the umbrella of the body for the purposes of this video, most obvious in that of Radagon and Marika, but also characters like Malekith and Miquella, who each have their own alter egos and identities that encapsulate distinct elements of self. The game is built on a massive foundation of historical, religious and cultural references, and also Berserk. It wouldn't be a game directed by Miyazaki otherwise. But it is these references and textures that go hand in hand with the game's presentation of self, body and identity, something that I don't think gets talked about enough in the community. This exploration culminates in the story of the once shaman village girl, Queen Marika, revealed to us in much more depth thanks to the Shadow of the Erd Tree DLC. But before we get into Marika, her ascent to godhood, and her eventual shattering, which would go on to shape everything in the lands between, let's look at the rest of the Pantheon and how each would-be lord exploits life and creation. Believe me when I say that these themes can be found in every character in the game, but I didn't want to spend 10 years talking about literally everyone, so expect a part 2. Also, this video assumes basic knowledge of the actual game and is full of spoilers. I think it's important to introduce this with a look at the creation of life and the eventuality of death in the lands between, because there's a lot more to it than one might imagine, and it helps to lay a foundation for why body and form take such thematic precedence throughout the game. Traditional births as seen in our own society do happen in the lands between, but a feud is tainted and are left for creatures not spurred on by grace. So how are you supposed to be born then? This is very much up to interpretation, but I do subscribe to the views of Elden Ring historians, like the Tarnished Archaeologist, that life in the lands between, or more specifically in the Age of the Golden Order, is by and large begot by the Erd Tree in the form of fruit. Different orders, ages and factions have all had their varying approaches to this, as exemplified by the Nox, inhabitants of the Eternal Cities, who created the mimicry of life through silver tears, leading to the eventual creation of artificial life forms like the Albinaurics. We see something similar when we fight Rennala, the disgraced and heartbroken Cameron Royal, who's been using the amber egg left by Radagon upon his departure from her side to create her little sweetings. Followers of the serpent cult around the Volcano Manor have also been seen to explore alternative modes of birth, as the serpent's amnion tells us of a repellent birthing ritual. Basically, there's many ways that bodies actually come to be. This leads us into death in the world of Elden Ring, or the lack thereof. In Marika's age, the rune of death has been removed entirely, facilitating the eternal nature of the demigods. This is the Golden Order, something you hear repeated constantly throughout the game. To the best of my understanding, even free from the shackles of destined death, which is the eventual certainty of death that we see in our own world, there are ways to pass on, in that souls do eventually return to the Erd Tree, faster or slower depending on your importance, in the form of Erd Tree burial. What happens to the body is ambiguous, and researching it is kind of giving me a headache, but I think it's safe to say that there is a distinction between the death of the body and the death of the soul in the lands between, as evidenced by those who live in death, beings who reject the Erdree's call or are simply denied it, and Ranni and Godwyn, which we'll get into in a moment. Death can be quite hard to get one's head around in this game because, well, you're killing stuff all the time, and some respawn, others don't. And there's also guys who live in death, but all you really need to know is that souls are eternal during the time of the Golden Order, and god-slaying Empyreans like the Glow-Eyed Queen are no longer free to put anyone down for good, thanks to Marika sealing away the rune of death inside of her pet dog Malika. This is by no means comprehensive, and even now I struggle to completely get my head around all this, but I feel like the game's unorthodox approach to life and death is an important thing to establish in exploration of the body as a theme, especially when understanding the distinction between body and soul, how the former is malleable and changing, and the latter belongs to the greater will, eventually returning back to the Erdtree, essential to the cycle of life. I think Elden Ring is a good example of what becomes of the body in light of an assured soul, which is what we can now finally delve into. Ranni and Godwyn's story begins in the flashpoint that commences the shattering, and solidifies the idea of the body as something malleable, separate from one's soul. The first time we hear about the Night of the Black Knives is in the game's glossy story trailer, where Ranni tells us that the death of Godwyn is the act that pushed Marika to the brink. But there's much more to this than just being the inciting incident for the shattering. Ranni, in pursuit of freedom from the Greater Will and the Elden Ring's order, orchestrates this plot to free herself from her Empyrean body. For on the Night of the Black Knives, it is Godwyn's soul that dies, slain with a fragment of the Rune of Death. At the same time, Ranni's own flesh is slain, both marked to facilitate an incomplete death. The consequences of this is a corruption of Godwyn's remains, a body with nowhere to go that permeates the stench of death. And with Ranni's Empyrean form gone, her soul is transferred into a specially prepared doll, one modelled on Ranni's old teacher, the heretical Snowy Crone. Through Ranni and Godwyn, we see the agency of those working against the greater, metaphorical and celestial bodies, seeking to impose their will, and in the Elden Ring's case, the greater will.
How long will it be, I wonder, before the tarnished tire of obeisance to the two fingers?
Suddenly, this incident that precedes the game becomes all the more poignant when we see it as an act of rebellion in the hopes of retaining one's own autonomy, rather than a self-serving slaying to raise one's position, the likes of which took place all too often in the ancient dynasties that the game models itself on. One can't help but see the irony in Ranni trying to free herself from the Greater Will's influence and keep control of her faculties, only to have to shed the very body she hoped to protect. But what is really highlighted here again is the fickle nature of the body in Elden Ring. In Ranni's case, one's actual flesh, bones and blood is far from precious, and in its place a new one is formed, free of its Empyrean shackles. To focus on Godwyn for a moment, why his body did all that, nobody really knows outside of life without a soul seems to have created this abomination. As to the actual origins of his appearance, that's actually quite interesting, so I'll quickly cover it. Zuli the Witch introduces us to the Nino, a Japanese mer creature with references dating back to the 7th century. It is said to be an ill omen and portender of calamity. Not only that, but eating part of its flesh is also said to impart longevity. Godwyn's fishy likeness seems to have its base. This isn't the first time that FromSoft has used the Nino in its games either, and as such, the connection here actually seems pretty strong. Julie also points out in another one of her videos, the way in which Godwyn's corrupted and mutated form is spreading throughout the lands between. Most notably in Lindell, his likeness can be seen manifesting onto the backs of crabs, directly above his underground resting place. I saw somebody in the comments on Zuli's video say that this could be his body retaliating against his betrayal, trying to stamp out the natural life of the lands between, but I look at it with much more sympathy. I see a body without a soul, desperately clinging onto anything bearing the life that he himself has denied. But also, the crabs are eating contaminated water, so I'm probably just reading into it, and we need to see Godwyn's curse of death/undeath as a disease more so than anything. A taint to the lands, something that shouldn't be. This is a wrench in the natural order of things, or at least the greater will's order of things. What's important here is to see the extent to which the body can change in the world of Elden Ring, the manner in which it is possible for it to manifest, and the soul is distinct and separate. And in this, we see what happens when a godly vessel is without its driver. In the case of Ranni, we see her forego the body in the pursuit of her complete autonomy, in the hopes of ushering in her Age of Stars, an age in which order is far removed, no longer entwined into life in the lands between. Though Ranni's ambitions are big, there are implications for all bodies that remain, in that no more will they be at the mercy of celestial influence, and that the very senses will never again come to head with the so-called grace of gold.
Now cometh the age of the stars. A 1,000-year voyage under the wisdom of the moon. Here beginneth the chill night that encompasses all, reaching the great beyond.
And in the case of poor Godwyn, once golden, now Prince of Death, his remains are left to rot at the roots of the old order, bestowing a form of life to those unwilling or not wanting to return to the Erdtree, his body attempting to take root wherever it can. In pursuit of life, or perhaps even light, like the weeds in your garden or the stems that find its way up to the sun, clinging on wherever it can. In these characters, philosophical dualism is introduced to the player, the idea that the body and soul are truly distinct from one another. This is reaffirmed and continually explored throughout the game, especially in the questline surrounding the Prince of Death and the Lunar Princess. Dee, Hunter of the Dead, is of 2 bodies, 2 minds, but 1 soul, and when he dies in the Deathbed Companion's questline, it is his brother who dons his twin armor to finish the job. And just south of Ranni's Rise is Preceptor Celovus, who reminds us that the body is simply a tool and a vessel through his tarnished puppets. Hey, this kind of reminds me of another game with puppets and dolls.
There's a dollhouse.
The dollhouse? No, really? What's going on here? And why am I wearing this dress?
I talked a bit about Godrick in the intro, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but as the first Shardbearer and the first Legacy Dungeon boss, Godrick does a lot to inform the player on the game's themes, and makes for a great antithesis to one of the last bosses you'll fight in the game, Godfrey, first Consort of Marika. So let's take a look at the self-styled Lord of all that is golden, and the desperate clinging onto of his once great lineage. The game's first dungeon, now occupied by the far-removed descendant of Marika's golden lineage, is a complete shell of its former glory. Bodies are piled up in disused courtyards, corpses can be seen strung up for dismemberment, and a grafted scion, the result of Godrick's lust for power in its most basic form, prowls the castle's once bustling great hall. All who have had the misfortune of coming into contact with Godrick and his army are disgusted by the diluted demigod, and have little good to say about him.
Honestly, Godrick's nothing more than a jumped-up country bumpkin. Lord? Oh, don't make me laugh. First, he hid himself amongst the womenfolk to flee the capital, then hid from Radagon in that castle. Then he insulted Melania, lost to her in battle, only to lick her boots, rather than die like a man. Has he no shame? The big girl's blouse? And to think, he's the blood of Godfrey, last of the golden lineage. You almost wouldn't know it to look at him. Yeah.
And the rest of Stormvale's inhabitants are cowardly deserters, flying the banner of a man who would sink so lowly as to hide amongst the women fleeing the royal capital at the height of the shattering, the Elden Ring's anchor rune in tow. These are not the acts of a man destined or born for greatness. The grafting of body parts only acts as a dilution of himself. Also, Godrick makes a habit of targeting the tarnished, the very souls who have been called back to the lands between by grace. What I'm getting at here is that in Godrick we see the portrayal of a feeble man, striving to be complete, to achieve power in any way he can, hoping to one day return to our home, bathed in rays of gold. Not only does this give us a sense of scale for the time that has passed since Marika's transgression, but also puts him at direct odds with Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, whose time in the lands between was righteous and fruitful. One look at the grafted descendant and it's clear that he aspires to be as great as Godfrey was. His axe bears his symbol, his soldiers' surcoats depict emblems of the golden lineage, its glory all now past. And when we finally meet the golden lineage's patriarch towards the end of the game, we feel the weight of the giant before us. This is the man who waged war against the giants and led the Long March, all in the name of Marika, and on his back, Sarosh, the Beast Regent, keeping his lust for battle in check. By all accounts, Godfrey appears relatively normal when compared to Godrick, which makes sense, he's been away from these lands a long time. But even more important is that we see Godfrey as a complete being, his destiny made, his choices certain. He becomes himself even more so when in the second phase of your battle, Sarosh is released from his service and Godfrey embraces his true identity, Horalu, warrior.
That will be all. Thou didst me good service, Sarosh. I've given thee courtesy enough.
Now I fight as Horalu. Warrior!
This is the man he became after being dismissed from Marika's service and banished from the lands. Or, as item descriptions found throughout the game would suggest, the man he was always destined to be. There are no cheap tricks for Horalu, no fire-spitting dragon heads and extra arms to swing blindly, just good old-fashioned fist fighting. This is the true strengths of the Tarnished, made even stronger alone, and again the complete antithesis to everything Godrick had become in his misguided attempt to mimic even a fraction of Godfrey's spirit. Evidently, identity is a massive part of these two characters. In Godrick and Godfrey, Miyazaki asks us, who are we, and who do we want to be?
Now I fight as Horalu.
All that is golden.
Warrior!
I am the Lord of all that is golden. And one day, we'll return together to our home, bathed in rays of gold.
Brave, tarnished. Thy strength befits same crown.
He had an ugly heart, an uglier countenance, and met the ugliest of ends, eh?
In Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy, we once again see the game's imagery and themes revolve around the body and its extremities. Finger creepers lurk all over Mount Gelmir, agents of the Greater Will seeking out and watching those who would blaspheme against its order. And all throughout Rykard's domain are snake-like creatures that go against the Golden Order's vision of life. For on Mount Gelmir, the site of one of the most bitter and bloody battles in all of the Shattering, the elder son of Rennala and Radagon has made communion with the great serpent Igle, completely transmuting his Empyrean form into something far more grotesque. And in this union, Rykard, as so many others have attempted, has given birth to new beings in acts reviled by the Golden Order. Although this video aims to highlight the body as a linking theme throughout everything the game explores, it has to be said that the snakes on Mount Gelmir are one of the strongest links to its other themes and ideas, especially in the way the zone takes from real-world culture and mythos. In the Great Snake, we see a resemblance to Jormungandr, the Norse world serpent, and in-game we suspect her name is Igle. This comes from a Lithuanian folktale about a girl called Igle who becomes a queen of serpents. Interesting to note is that this also means spruce tree. And of course the game's Christian imagery is never far away in the Erdree's regard of snakes as traitors, not unlike the snake tempting Eve in the Garden of Eden. But for all the mythological and cultural references that surround this section, it does once again manifest in the form of literal bodies. In resistance to the Greater Will, Rykard willingly gives himself to the god-devouring serpent, something we see briefly in the game's opening cutscene, fully realised by the time we enter his boss arena. In this sacrilegious act, we see Rykard was not just consumed by the snake, but is fused with it, his face appearing on its back, his elongated bejeweled fingers wielding his blasphemous blade. The same arms and hands that stain the sword appear on the snake god's back too, indicative of the countless people and heroes Rykard has devoured and brought into his family. I'm not sure whether it's fair to call this act cannibalistic, given that Rykard appears now to be more snake than man, but on Mount Gelmir, soldiers can be seen partaking in the flesh of fallen comrades too. I think this exists to highlight the depravity that sits atop Mount Gelmir, but also to introduce hunger in connection to Rykard, a base instinct of the body, while also reinforcing the idea of it as something disposable or transient. Where Godrick uses body parts for grafting and the Erdtree reabsorbs souls for Erdtree birth, Rykard and the Great Snake consumes them for unbridled power, joining in blasphemous union. Something interesting to note is that the serpent permits a base hunger unseen in much of the other denizens of the lands between. There is also a tenuous connection to the crucible here that I'd like to quickly mention. The crucible represents the primordial form of life, early evolution. In this blended age, beings represented multiple characteristics found throughout the animal kingdom, with horns being a highly sought after and respected trait. I wouldn't be surprised if Rykard's serpent came from this early crucible of life. On Mount Gelmir, at the Temple of Igle, we fight a godskin who possesses crucible aspects similar to Mount Gelmir's man-serpents. And in the home of the horn scent, remnants of snakes can also be found. On man-serpents, so now would be a good time to talk about these creatures, in particular, the Volcano Manor Scout, Raya. There is a natural human instinct to understand our own origins, and though she might not realize it, this is exactly what Raya seeks to determine when she asks of the Tarnished if they too have heard strange sounds in the manor, like that of slithering scales.
Oh, Fi, what am I saying? It just isn't possible. I must be tired.
It is upon this investigation that we learn of Raya's true form as a man-serpent, Zarias.
What's that peculiar look upon your face? Goodness, am I still a serpent? Oh, how dreadful.
Zarias, like so many others in the lands between, is the owner of dual identities, although her human form is likely no more than an illusion or projection to keep her safe on the road. Lacking in human characteristics, Zarias fears persecution and mistrust in her serpent form, the remains of long-lasting prejudice dating to the start of the Age of the Erdtree, for Zarias was not born of its grace, or more specifically, born of a king's grace, as though she had long thought, the gentle soothings of her adopted mother Tanith. Zarias' full revelation comes at the discovery of the serpent's amnion, proof of the repellent birthing ritual that spawned this unwanted offspring. Her questline puts her at odds with a mother's love, as Tanith seeks to remedy the inquisitive serpent's desire to know the truths of her birth through the administration of a tonic of forgetfulness. We see that Tanith only has love in her heart for serpents and welcomes Zarias with open arms, but is this a reflection of the temptation of the seductive power of the snake, which has allowed her to love something only described in games unwanted, born of something repellent? Whether her love is sincere or a seduction, she still seeks to free her daughter of answers, to truly know herself. Here, again, we are reminded of the battle for life that takes place in-game, juxtaposed against the vision of the greater will that would put down other forms of birth as abhorrent. Zarias' entire questline revolves around a reconciliation with this birth, which grants her the very form that she possesses. We are asked constantly by Elden Ring whether or not the body that we inhabit is worthy. Is Zarias really so repellent? Well, in the case of a giant snake that wants to devour the world, maybe, but for Raya, she is well-spoken, polite, virtually no different to any of the other kind souls we meet on our journey throughout the game. There are a few ways to wrap up Zarias' questline, the most fulfilling being one where she is not granted the mercy killing she so asks for after learning the truths of her birth, and also not drugged by her mother so as to forget from whence she came. What this allows her to do is to leave the Volcano Manor of her own will, to journey onwards in pursuit of answers to her origins. In this, Zarias comes to terms with her body and aims to reach its full extent, herself. Now I think it's finally time to talk about the Golden Order's matriarch and the culmination of everything we've been talking about today. I want to show you just how much the game's bodily themes directly entwine with its figurehead. Pretty much everywhere in the lands between, Marika can be seen welcoming her subjects with open arms. Her body, however you want to read into this, is all over in the form of statues and stakes. Looking at the pose on the statues found throughout the world, I wonder if this is more than just a warm embrace. Just as Shinto priestesses and Greek oracles were thought in ancient times to possess deities, allowing them to communicate with humans, Marika is the Golden Order's living, breathing god, a conduit for the greater will, and is revered as such. Worshipping something that looks human is a lot easier than whatever the Elden Beast is. When we finally get to her at the end of the game, we see this embrace inverted. She is crucified on the rune arc, and upon shifting into Radagon, we see the Golden Order imbued within him, before finally revealing the Elden Beast as the true god. We'll get into Radagon in a bit, but essentially, Marika is the spearhead and the imposer of the Age of the Erdtree, and as players, we know that all was once in opposition to it. Is it a parasite, an invader? Well, possibly in part, but also it is that these lands were once under the dominion of the Fell God, evidenced by the Fire Giant's very embodiment of the Outer God, and Godfrey, the Queen's consort, waging war against these same giants, sealing the flame away. In the same way that the Fell God appears literally on the Fire Giant's torso, Marika is also joined in literal, physical union with the Greater Will's vassal, the Elden Beast, evidenced in the game's final fight, and it is speculated to be the same beast that has Marika crucified and impaled through her lower abdomen, the part of herself that would have traditionally bestowed life outside of a world of Erdtree births and burials. I'm reminded of the seat of Mog's dynasty, where Mikola awaits rebirth atop a pelvis, symbolic of the womb, and another instance where the female body bears importance. One mustn't ignore the clear subjugation of Marika as a woman here, especially when births make up so much of the game's themes, tying into our broader investigation of the body. I do have to quickly touch on the fact that obviously theology plays a massive role here. It's very important to Miyazaki's world building, and I recognise its thematic impact. Christianity has long had its obsession with the body of its prophet, Catholics going so far as to figuratively eat it. It's also worth mentioning the Norse parallels of Marika's crucifixion too, as Odin was also once victim of a sacrifice. Read in the poem Havmal, we see him hung and speared on the world tree after confessing the origin of the runes. Runes, I believe, being the ancient alphabet of the times. What is illustrated here is that within the game's other elements, we see how the body remains a persistent point of focus. We can also draw on the fact that Marika's imprisonment comes from sacrifice, and like Odin, she ends up in a tree. Whether or not the shattering of the Elden Ring was out of anguish for the death of her golden child, or if she truly understood the invasive nature of the Greater Will, it wasn't shattered for no reason. And as such, Marika chose to sacrifice everything in the hopes of changing the current order, the very same order that she brought into existence. Life was being dictated in the lands between, and suddenly it feels like Marika harkens back to her humble origins as a Numen shaman, context revealed to us in the shadow of the Erd Tree. Long before the seduction and the betrayal, Marika and the rest of the shamans were at the mercy of the Hornsent, the civilization of the Crucible. This long past culture were in the practice of stuffing miscreants into jars so that they could be reborn into better people, the source of the Jarmen. And alongside the criminal bodies awaiting jar rebirth was the tortured flesh of shaman maidens believed to have had an affinity for melding with others. The very same flesh that would meld with the Elden Beast. The Great Jar Helm description tells us, this is the cycle of death and rebirth, taken into the hands of mortal men. This one item tells us virtually everything and puts the body, identity, life and death at the very center of the game's messaging. Marika's ascent to godhood looks like a personal grievance against the Hornsent, the very same mortal men who were responsible for the slaughtering of her kin. And now Marika's crusade against the Crucible, the pre-existing melting pot of life, makes sense. For this is the age that the Hornsent are from, and we can see this in the Crucible knot that is present on the jar-ended enemies in the Land of Shadow. And when Marika has two omen-born children possessing the qualities of the Crucible, they are hidden and kept secret from a society that shuns and reviles these characteristics, a society that she herself had forged. So the reasons of Marika's ambition are finally laid out, and it's important to recognize how the body remains central to this. Flesh, blood and bones are a tool of the Hornsent to repent criminals in a twisted form of rebirth, and Marika seeks to avoid this for herself, wanting a right to her own body. It is in this that we see the game's great irony, that Marika's ambition leads her to the two fingers, literal body parts by the way, who go on to deny her the agency she once sought, which in turn prompts all the events of the game. This is best exemplified when journeying to the hidden shaman village, once Marika's home. Here, the Tarnished discovers a golden braid, left by Marika as an offering to the elusive grandmother. Interestingly, this part of herself boosts holy resistance, which, don't forget, is a damage type that belongs to the Golden Order and the Greater Will. Which does make me wonder as to why Radagon and Mikula wield holy damage when they seek to rid themselves of the Old Order, but that's a question for another time. Ultimately, we see Marika held captive by the very thing she used to free her body from chains. The Eternal Queen granted her subjects and her kin endless life and ages of plenty, only to be bound by servitude to the Elden Ring, and more importantly, the Elden Beast, which takes residence literally within her. Okay, before we wrap this up, I really need to talk about Marika's other half, the red-haired Radagon. Where others take on symbolic identities like Godfrey and Horalu, Marika embodies it literally in the Golden Order fundamentalist. One of the most interesting things Elden Ring does with its characters is to make their other aspects real, physical manifestations. This same dual self can be seen in Mikula and Saint Trina, who is, as far as I know, the only other confirmed instance of a physical split in an Empyrean. I subscribe to the line of thinking that puts Radagon as coming solely from Marika. I don't believe him to have ever been an independent being, rather a part of her that embodies other ideals. We know full well that Radagon was used to further her agenda, in that he married Queen Rennala, putting an end to the Liurnian Wars and uniting the lands between. We also know that Radagon went on to reform the Golden Order following his departure from Liurnia, returning to Queen Marika as consort. Here we see a Marika almost at odds with herself. I've long wondered if she ever had agency over Radagon, or if the two fingers play a part in an Empyrean's ability to have an aspect. Essentially, was Radagon for her, or was it for the Greater Will? What's important to see is her conflict in identity and the way that again they take literal form. This inner conflict manifests itself as a feminine side that once used the powers of the Elden Ring to cement her dynasty, only to destroy it, and a masculine side who adhered faithfully to its teachings. Something I've also always found interesting and never seen fully answered is the way we see Radagon in many of the Lands Between's denizens too. For example, in the Red Wolf of Radagon and the Leonine Misbegotten. Also, the similarity in Radagon's red hair and the locks of the fire giants, a trait he detested in himself. I'm not sure about the connection to the giants, but what the similarity to the two other beasts highlights is an essential tenet of Golden Order fundamentalism, the law of regression, in that all things yearn to eternally converge. Radagon feels almost intrinsic to the world he inhabits. It's hard to fully get to the bottom of this, but if anyone else can see more to it, please let me know. The last thing I'll mention of Radagon is what happens to him after his defeat at the hands of the Tarnished. As gods, their bodies are tools to impose order and will. We can see this inside of Radagon during the boss fight, in the way he houses the Golden Order. But now, Radagon becomes a tool of action, literally wielded by the Elden Beast against you. Elden Ring shows us how important the body, its soul, and its identity is constantly. There really are countless examples, and I feel I have only just scratched the surface in highlighting a theme that undercurrents the game's bigger explorations of cultures, creeds, and religions. So, to summarize everything we talked about and learnt in this video, for Godrick it was to become, to attain the heights of his lineage, through the misguided and twisted union of tortured body parts onto himself. Comparatively, Godfrey's legacy was already secure, and we see this in the way that he's revered throughout the game. Even more importantly though, is that when we do come to blows with Godfrey at the end of the game, he returns to his newfound identity of Hoarah, a warrior who fights us in unarmed combat as himself, become onto entirely. The very same identity he discovered when free of the lands between. For Ranni, it was to be free of the strings of a celestial puppet master, shedding her Empyrean body in the process, a painful and difficult journey, but one that would free all bodies in the lands between of godly influence. Godwyn was sacrificed for this right, and without a soul, his body becomes a pox on the lands, an affront to the current order, but also a mutation in death, a body without an identity. Rykard is realized by the god-devouring serpent, giving up his body for an all-consuming hunger, one that invites others into his own blend of life, and opposing a long-repulsed force to the divine Erdtree. Raya is born of this snake, a ritual that differs from edicts of the Erdtree in the Elden Ring, but ultimately finishes her journey accepting of her reptilian origins, one that began long before the age of the Erdtree. And finally, for Marika and Radagon, this is about the cost of freedom and bodily autonomy. Be it a temptation or a seduction, Marika still sought to free herself of the shaman's destiny, sacrificing her body to the greater will. And this part of her identity, bathed in gold, became manifest in Radagon, who would literally come to house the tenets of the Golden Order and fight against himself during the Shattering, the moment of Marika's realization and rejection of her gift. Behind these actors on Elden Ring's stage, whose bodies and identities come into constant conflict with each other, is the greater will and its two fingers, something I have mentioned a lot throughout the video. As I have alluded to before, it is this celestial body that first put things into motion, a cosmic force of life that long ago sent the Elden Beast to the lands between upon an Elden Star, and with it its envoy, the Two Fingers, orators acting as guides to the demigods. We learn in the DLC that these fingers came from Mother Metyr, another creature sent down by the Greater Will, before the Elden Beast. In this, we get another huge revelation in the game structure of its themes. The Mother of Fingers, another embodiment of the Hand of God, is described as being broken and abandoned by the Greater Will. Ymir tells us the very foundation of order was rotten from the beginning. The very path that Marika had taken was founded on false information. Here we finally learn a great truth. It's not that there is no God, it's that God doesn't answer. All we're left with is a shitty voicemail with outdated and outmoded information. The two fingers that stand prostrate in the round table hold, communing with the Greater Will, are never going to get a response. Ymir puts it best when he says the roots were rotted from the very beginning. Poor Metyr, evoking a modicum of sympathy, is denied its purpose and has been endlessly ringing home. The celestial body, made of fingers and prints, is the one responsible for all the folly that has taken place. But it is in this meaningless folly that we've seen bodies rising and falling, becoming and going. In spite of God's absence, we attempt to become regardless. Like so many of Miyazaki's games, is emblematic of the struggle of life, and in the lands between, we see it through the lens of bodies and identity, more often than not. There are so many more examples I could talk about, but this video is long enough as it is, and I've been dying to get something out. Next time I'd like to focus on Nicola and Millennia and the Omen-born twins. I really have no idea why I didn't talk about Miquella in this one, but hey. As always, thank you so much for watching. It means a tremendous amount to me if you managed to make it to the end.